Hello everybody and welcome to SCMR Talking Heads number 3. I'm Paul Statham from the Sussex Centre of Migration Research, here as usual in Living Room Central, presenting our number 3 Talking Heads. As I've already said in the earlier ones, the idea behind this series is to get people to talk about research that's already been published and, as I like, give you a sort of agenda setting taster of why they did what they did from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And today I'm delighted that we have Marta Bivand Erdal from PRIO and Ceri Oeppen from the University of Sussex, SCMR, to talk to you about an article that they recently published in a great journal, the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, that you may have heard of. And yeah, let me talk a little bit first about Marta and Ceri. I was initially going to describe them as rising stars, but I think it's pretty clear to say that within the migration field, their stars rose some time ago and that they're now established and leading figures. Actually, as a double act, they have written other articles, and a particularly important one that's been, I think it's actually within the top 10 cited articles in JEMS, is one of the few articles that starts to look at the relationship between integration and transnationalism and how those things can be put together in a way that is meaningful for research. And if you like, today is another product of their double act, and it's called Forced to Leave, the Discursive and Analytic Significance of Describing Migration as Forced and Voluntary. And again, you can see that they're working here of moving beyond some of the dualisms we have. Other people such as Elizabeth Fossell have talked about whether we should call things forced or voluntary migration, thinking about it being graded. Anyway, they'll tell you more about that in a minute. First of all, let me then present some background to Marta. She's research professor in migration studies at PRIO, the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, where they've recently also set up a migration research centre that she directs along with Jørgen Carling. She has written many articles, and as many people in PRIO, she's been leading a lot of important research projects in the field of migration, and very recently won a very prestigious ERC starting grant that I assume will take up most of her time over the next years, the title of which is Migration Rhythms and Trajectories of Upward Social Mobility in Asia. Moving on to Ceri, she's senior lecturer in human geography at Sussex, and a member of the SCMR, and she most of her research focuses on migration, transnationalism, integration, and she's also done a lot of research on Afghanistan. She also has a number of ongoing projects that are very prestigious and is building up a wonderful profile. Anyway, that's enough from me. I now hand over to Marta and Ceri, who will take you through the rest of this journey. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Paul, for letting us talk about our paper today. We're really pleased to discuss this particular paper, Forced to Leave, the Discursive and Analytical Significance of Describing Migration as Forced and Voluntary, because it's really quite a special paper to us. We've written other things together, but I think this one, it really means a lot to us because it's the result of conversations over many years, both academic conversations, but also over a cup of tea or a beer. So we're very happy to talk more about it today. The main aim of the paper is to try and question or to try and unpick the distinction between forced and voluntary migration. This is already done, but we're trying to take that discussion a step further, and Marta's going to say something about what we're trying to do in the paper.
Basically, everyone knows that these types of distinctions are sort of messy and complicated, and they've been deconstructed many times before. But it always feels a bit like a sort of cop-out solution to just say that something is complex and then move on. And in this particular context with forced and voluntary migration and the labeling of those, it really makes a difference, a sort of real-life difference for people, for migrants, which labels they end up with. So in this sense, this complexity isn't just something we want to engage with analytically and conceptually because it's interesting, but because it really, really matters. And it matters to the migrants that we've been working with.
In the paper, we'll try not to present the paper as a whole, but to say something very briefly about what we're trying to do. So the first thing we're trying to do is to talk about the labels of forced and voluntary and why they're important. Then we look to try and engage with some of the discussions around voluntariness from a more philosophical point of view, so particularly building on the work of political philosophers like Ceri Oeppen, to try and think about what it really means for a decision to be voluntary. So getting away from just the label voluntary, but what does it really mean? Then we look at comparing briefly Afghan and Pakistani migration. So this areas of migration that we've both worked on that have a lot of overlaps. And obviously they're in a geographically similar region, but also lots of overlaps in terms of migrants' experiences. But Pakistani and Afghan migrants are normally labelled differently because of the political context of Pakistan and Afghanistan. So the next thing we do in the paper is to try and look at Afghan and Pakistani migration at different stages of migration. So leaving, traveling, arriving, settling, returning, to see where that forced and voluntary label matters or not.
Okay, so what we want to do now is basically to say something about how the paper came about. And we'll say a little more about that perhaps from personal angles, and then a little bit more of the sort of conceptual theoretical drivers behind it as well. And then we've actually looked a bit at how people who've read the article and used it have used it. And of course, that's exciting, but we still feel there's more work to be done here. So we want to reflect a bit on that as well. So what's left to do in a sense. And then also we have some reflections on why this topic is quite challenging to work with, and perhaps also why it took us quite a long while to get from the idea to the published article in this case.
So what shaped our ideas for this paper, and also who shaped the ideas for this paper? And we can trace the ideas and the discussions behind this paper right back to our undergraduate research. Some of you might know that Marta and I did our undergraduate degree together in London in geography at UCL. And there are two people in particular, many people have shaped this paper, and we could list many colleagues at Sussex and PRIO and elsewhere who have done so, but we just wanted to highlight two particular people. Tony O'Connor, who sadly died last year, and Khalid Kossa. So I'm going to say a little bit about Tony, and Marta's going to say a little bit about Khalid in terms of how their teaching shaped the paper's ideas. So Tony O'Connor taught us for post-colonial Africa, the module post-colonial Africa. And one of the things that he really kind of showed us through his teaching and through his own research was the importance of challenging assumptions. So particularly in his work, challenging assumptions about representations of Africa, but also about how important it was to kind of dig behind the image, to go and to look up kind of facts and try and find out more about them. So to look up development statistics and think about where they came from and why they're being presented the way they are. Also, looking back on Tony's work, something that we didn't realise at the time, but as Hugh Clout writes in his obituary, Tony really was ahead of his time in terms of profiling and highlighting African academics in African studies. And the great thing for us is that that was normal. The fact that he was saying to us, if you want to find out about Tanzania, go and read what Tanzanian academics are writing about it. That was normal to us while we were studying, and we really appreciate that in our current work. Most importantly, what Tony got us to do was to question categories, and I think that has shaped our paper in terms of questioning categories of forced and voluntary. And I think Marta's going to say a little bit about Khalid and how he shaped this paper as well.
Yeah, so with Khalid, most of the teaching that he was doing for us was on migration-related issues. And so that was part of different courses, including the first year international problems course, which Tony also contributed to. So we also took a module that Khalid was teaching at SOAS, which specifically focused on refugees. And already then it was a refugee crisis. And the focus was also on the international refugee regime, but also regimes in plural in a sense, because there was also a focus on what was going on in Latin America and in Africa as well as in Europe and in Asia. And so throughout that course, there was a lot of focus on migration categories and different types of people who might be more or less forcibly forced to move from where they were, and whether they should be labeled then maybe as refugees or as IDPs or not, and the legal frameworks around that. So there was a lot of focus on interdisciplinary contributions to these discussions. So we were reading things from IR, from law, to the extent that we managed to actually understand that, at least, from political science, from economics as well. So there was a lot of focus on migration studies as being something quite interdisciplinary, although of course we were doing a geography degree. And as part of that geography degree, we also were doing field work. So one of the images here is from a field trip to Tunisia. This was a couple of years after we had done our field trip to Tunisia as well. And I think that is an example also of how we were taught by Khaled and also by Tony to really look for ourselves, to try and investigate things in terms of what they were looking like on the ground physically, and also trying to see what people were doing, trying to speak to people, to try and understand how they were making sense of their own lives, and their sort of meeting also with structures in their own lives. I think also what Khaled showed us in a very practical way through his teaching was a sort of collegiality within migration studies. And when we were doing our undergraduate dissertations, he was very supportive of that. We were doing fieldwork in New Delhi with Afghans in the summer of 2001. And of course, well, we'd been digging around in archives and in libraries to learn more about Afghan refugees in early 2001 when no one else was interested. Later on in that year, a lot more people were interested and found out much more about what was going on in Afghanistan and with refugees from Afghanistan from different periods of time. And Khaled then basically told us to write a text box for forced migration review based on our undergraduate research in New Delhi. And even though it was just undergraduate research, he was extremely sort of supportive of that and made that happen, which was of course really inspiring. And I think in a way, as a sort of first publication, quite important for both of us later on when we started our PhD work.
Yeah, it's really, so many people have shaped the kind of background work on this paper, but these two in their kind of undergraduate degrees kind of started the thinking about forced and voluntary migration and who is a refugee and what it means to be a refugee, which in turn shaped our future work. We also wanted to say something about the ideas from a more kind of academic point of view, or conceptual point of view, I should say, in terms of shaping this paper. So Marta, would you like to say something about your PhD and how that fed into this paper?
Yes, I think the personal connects quite well with this as well, in the sense that we of course stayed friends afterwards and stayed in touch and went on to do our different PhDs. And so my PhD project was on remittances to Pakistan, and I was focusing on Pakistani migrants in Norway predominantly, and also on their family members back in Pakistan. And so a very specific focus, moving away from working on themes to do with Afghanistan or with the Sri Lankan diaspora that I worked on for my master's. But the conversations with Ceri continued. And as Ceri also mentioned earlier, this sort of idea that migration from Pakistan was something inherently different to migration from Afghanistan was something that continued to be a topic of conversation and exchange between us then, because there were, of course, differences, and there are differences that are salient. But in our conversations and exchanges about fieldwork and about, drinking tea with people with these migration backgrounds, we kept finding that actually there's quite a lot of similarities. And it's not just about geographic proximity of these countries of origin. There's something more that we could probably investigate here.
Yeah, so I carried on to do my PhD research with Afghan refugees, moving to look at Afghans predominantly in America, but also looking at some people who had returned from America to Afghanistan. And I was also looking at transnational activities, not so much at remittances, although somewhat at remittances too. So as Marta said, we were kind of continuing to discuss ideas throughout that time. And although we were taught by Carlin and Tony to kind of question categories and putting people in boxes, there is one particular type of categorization that we have found useful in this paper, and that's the idea of a kind of migratory journey. And this came from the the way we were thinking about it from being taught as undergraduates was from the book The End of the Refugee Cycle. So the idea that people leave, arrive, settle, and eventually, in theory at least, return. And there's a very important question mark in that title of the book, The End of the Refugee Cycle. And that idea of thinking about how different stages of a migratory journey might be very different in terms of experiences has also fed into this paper. So we've just got that kind of cycle there that we used to think about where the label of forced and voluntary mattered in terms of at different stages of the migratory journey.
So then coming back to this idea that the sort of differences between Afghans and Pakistanis based on the categorizations and the bureaucratic labels that they often are sort of rubric under should be really, really key importance. Led us to this desire to analyze what is actually going on and what is going on with these categories if we don't generalize and say, you know, these people are like this or these people are like that, but actually see what's going on at the particular stages of this migration process more specifically. And so that's actually what we did very much in detail in the paper.
So the next thing we did in terms of thinking not just where the paper came from, but what's happened to the paper, was to look at who had cited the paper. And this was a little bit nerve-wracking, but also really nice as well to see that people have looked at the paper and taken things from it. And I think Marta's going to say a little bit about the sort of things that people appear to have taken from the paper in terms of how they've cited it.
Yes, I guess what was quite interesting to look at was to see, you know, this idea that, you know, stuff is complex and we shouldn't just deconstruct, we should try and do something more to actually see, you know, for whom, how and when do these differences in categorization matter? What has happened to that? So that was kind of one of our aims with the paper, and what has actually happened to that in terms of how people are citing it or using the paper. And I think what we're finding is that the argument that we make that migration and refugee studies need to talk more together, that resonates. There's quite a lot of different papers that sort of agree and cite those kinds of points, which, you know, to be fair, are fairly obvious, I think, but still probably need to be made. And it's a good reminder, and perhaps also for people who are coming into working with migration and also with refugees, that it's important to be aware that these are not separate fields and they shouldn't be seen as such. And also this sort of use of the migration cycle seems to be taken up a bit as well. So actually trying to not focus on everything that has to do with the migrant group as a whole, but maybe focusing a little bit more on aspects of leaving or of the journey specifically. There's a lot of research on as well. And actually looking specifically at the issues of force and also voluntariness, which still probably needs to be done more, but there's some of that as well. And also the fact that it's important to differentiate between labels that are being applied by states and descriptive labels that come from empirical observations, and also from the ways in which migrants themselves actually use labels or label themselves or describe themselves as well, and that these are not necessarily the same as well. And that there is a lot of complexity which these labels and categories also allow for.
Yeah, and I think that the point relating to labels that people have picked up on, which we're really pleased about because it's one of the points we hoped people would take away from the paper, is that on the one hand, as academics, it's good that we would question bureaucratic labels and question how accurate they are. But whether they're accurate or not, they can have a real effect on migrants' lives. So, for example, whether someone is labelled by a government as a refugee or not will obviously have a real effect on their life experiences. And so I think it's really important that whilst we kind of tackle these categories and problematize them or try and deconstruct them, that we don't ignore the real effect that they have. And we were really pleased to see that people have picked up on that in terms of how they've cited the paper. And then the final point, and we're going to come back to this a bit, say a bit more about this later on, but the other point that people have picked up rightly is that debating this kind of forced voluntary spectrum is risky from an ethical point of view. If we look at that kind of blurry line between forced and voluntary or blurry spectrum, then are we questioning whether refugees are refugees or not? Is there a risk that we're somehow saying that people who are forced to migrate Perhaps they didn't have as much force in that decision as people might think. Or if we say that they're more towards the kind of voluntary end of the spectrum, does that mean that they shouldn't receive assistance? So anything where we're looking at these kind of forced voluntary spectrum, there are problems inherent in that. We'll come back to that in a bit. But first of all, we'd also like to highlight a couple of points which we put in the paper and maybe we ourselves could expand on, but we hope that other people might pick up on and expand in the future as well.
These points really relate to what Ceri was just talking about, and which we'll return to on the sort of ethical side of this in a sense, but more at the sort of conceptual or theoretical level, where we feel like there's probably more work to be done. And hopefully there are others that can contribute more to those conversations as well. And that pertains specifically to these issues of voluntariness. And what do we actually mean by voluntariness? You know, it's kind of a philosophical question. What does it mean that an action is entirely voluntary? And I think we can all relate to that on a sort of everyday basis, right? What is it that we actually do that is entirely voluntary in that moment? So I mean, it's worthwhile doing some of that philosophical reflection, but it's also possible, I think, to pin it down a bit more to make it more user-friendly in our work. And we certainly gained a lot from working with Ceri Oeppen's concept of acceptable alternatives. And so I guess one of the questions we've had is this useful? And can it be applied more widely within the context of migration studies? And what are the kind of limits, perhaps, of that? Because it is, it's a very useful concept, but at the same time, it is quite challenging. So, you know, acceptable for whom and, you know, in what kind of contexts? And I think it will be really interesting to see what more could be done with that. We've tried to do a little bit more ourselves in a forthcoming book chapter on theorizing voluntariness in return. But I think we both agree that there's more work to be done there, and it could be applied to many different contexts to see how far it could be pushed.
Yeah, we'd love it if anyone watching this would like to take us up on that challenge and build on that. That would be great. The other thing that we would like to see people build upon, that we talk about a bit in the paper, is some more analysis about the relationship between migration academics and policymakers. So it's a really tricky discussion, and there are ongoing discussions about sometimes very critical of the close nature of the relationship between migration scholars and policymakers. But what we'd like to see is more discussion about what the effects of that relationship are. So how does the closeness of that relationship affect how we think about migration categories, migration labels, and how it affects our work with migrants? We've kind of tried to simplify this by saying that there are three main groups of stakeholders in this discussion: academics, migrants, and policymakers. But also, of course, there's a lot of overlap between those categories. So we as academics might provide consultancy or advisory work to policymakers, and obviously we hope that our work will form the basis of evidence-based policy. We might be migrants ourselves, or be friends, or have family who are migrants. So it's not enough to just say we're all in these different groups, but actually to kind of look at the overlaps as well. But I think it's really important to think about how exactly this kind of, so we talk in the paper about how bureaucratic or policy-made labels shape academic understandings, and we question that and say, actually, we as academics should also be making our own judgment about whether something is forced or voluntary, rather than just looking at whether someone has been labelled as a refugee or not. But those are the kind of discussions that we would like to see further developed as well.
This links, I think, really well with our final point, which comes back to this issue of the ethical dilemmas involved in I guess, first of all, trying to write this paper. So we first presented the ideas for this paper at a conference in 2013, I think. And then, as with academic papers, often, you know, things evolve, and it's generally just for the better that it takes a bit of time and back and forth. But a recurring conversation we had a number of times between 2013 and when we actually submitted the final version to JEMS was about the kind of ethical challenges and the ethical responsibility that we have as academics writing about these topics. I think it also really links to this sort of the three main stakeholder groups on the slide. Also, in terms of connecting with those that aren't mentioned there, which are basically sort of the societies within which we work, the societies within which, from which migrants originate. Also, the media might be there. So there's kind of the whole sort of backdrop of everything else around us, which also shapes, of course, what we do and why and how as well.
So for our final slide, we just wanted to say a bit more about around this discussion. And the quote on the slide is from one of the papers that cite this, from a paragraph where they're citing our paper, and it's a paper about unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. And Elaine Chase et al. Writes, does stating that our informants have capabilities, choices and aspirations, even in the most constrained and extreme circumstances, make them less vulnerable and thus less eligible to legal and social protection? And this question really kind of gets to the heart of why we struggled with writing this paper. It was a difficult paper to write, probably, I think, the hardest paper that we've worked on together, certainly. And this was the kind of underlying question behind why it was difficult for us to write. In questioning this and in thinking about this paper, there are also a number of other questions that we were discussing, and this is why we talked earlier about collegiality and the migration studies community. It's so fantastic to be able to collaborate on things like this. But one of the questions that we kept on coming back to was this kind of background question of what is our role as academics? And I think this comes back to this kind of migration studies policymakers relationship as well. Who are we and what is our role? Are we responsible for what policymakers do with our research? And the fact is, whether we want to be or not, they might well take our research and work with it. And what are the things that we have to think about in that regard? What are the ethical challenges? And a lot of these ethical challenges come about from this kind of interface between academics and policymakers. And our role as academics ultimately is to investigate things, to find out about things, to research things, to learn about the world around us. But we also have responsibilities in terms of what we do with that information. And decisions around how activist we want to be with that information. Do we want to use our research for activism? And I'm sure all academics in all disciplines feel this, but particularly in migration studies, where it's such a kind of politicized subject, these questions are really quite complex and something that we talk about regularly, and we would encourage all migration scholars and students of migration studies to discuss as well.
I think it's particularly important sort of in relation to this topic, and really coming back to the quote on the slide and what we were also mentioning earlier in terms of whether the research that we do and how we represent that in our publications, which may or may not be picked up by policymakers, and certainly it might be picked up by them if there are blog posts and if there are more kind of shorter and popular versions of them around, which will be simplified. What happens with that down the line, and is there a risk somehow that we are making it more difficult for people who are claiming asylum to actually get the refugee status? And I think that's sort of the nightmare scenario in a way, that inadvertently, through doing our research, we are making things harder for people who are perhaps vulnerable and at risk. And that is something I think no one would want to happen, right? And I think that's kind of been a fear. But I think in that context as well, it's really been helpful for us in our discussions as well to really go back to this sort of basic training that we also had in geography and this sort of very empirical approach to science, grounded in doing field work, not necessarily always taking what you see at face value, but actually making sure you're looking and trying to understand what you're seeing, and talking to different types of people about what it is you're seeing and how you should be understanding that and relating to that. And then again, trying to reflect on what kind of reactions you get from that. And so I guess this sort of combination of being very empirically grounded and trying to be reflexive about it, but also keeping this ethical concern up front, has been really helpful for us in working with this paper, and sort of keeping faith in the fact that we as researchers have an extremely important role to play here, and that perhaps it is very important that we in a way help mediate also between what our migrants' experiences and what kind of labels they feel would describe their realities well, and the bureaucratic categorizations which are necessary for states, whether we may like that or not. They are necessary for states to be able to do the jobs that states have to do, but they aren't a one-to-one fit with migrant experiences. And then the researcher role of really trying to document what the empirical realities might be, also from multiple perspectives, is a really important role to uphold, and also to be aware of those kind of borderlines and interfaces with these other actors.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately what we're trying to do with this paper is to say, yes, labels have a role to play by bureaucrats, by states, and yes, it's right that academics question them, but it's not enough for academics to just say, oh, these labels aren't accurate, we're seeing something different empirically. We need to look at in what ways and for whom and when they're accurate or inaccurate, and basically rise to that challenge rather than just kind of shrugging and saying, oh, it's complicated, forced voluntary is a spectrum, we can't kind of go any further than that. So that's what we were really trying to do in this paper. We hope you find it useful, and we look forward to seeing how people take on some of these ideas.
Thanks a lot, Ceri and Marta. That was brilliant. Thanks a lot also for sharing with us your intellectual background and biography and what brought you to work on this topic and why you think it's important from a career perspective. I find that very helpful and useful, as well as the important points that you raised at the end about academics not simply normatively criticizing things, but representing the world in a way and engaging with the other side in ways that can bring forward meaningful change. So that's the end of Talking Heads number 3. I'm Paul Statham, Director of the Sussex Centre for Migration Research, and I look forward to joining you again next time. Bye-bye.